Hello, everybody. Welcome to the latest instalment of Women in History, which is going to look at Mary Shelley, the author of Frankenstein. And as we learned last time, Mary Godwin, as she was called originally, was born in 1797, the daughter of the two notorious radicals, William Godwin and Mary Wollstonecraft. A puny child, she wasn't expected to survive, but of course it was her mother who died. Her early years were dominated by the ghostly presence of this mother that she'd never known. Godwin treated his dead wife almost as a secular saint. Her portrait by John Opie hung in his room. He had a death mask made of her, and the 3 locks of her hair were cut before the coffin was sealed and preserved, one for the widower and one for each of her children, Mary and her half-sister Fanny Imlay. In the same spirit of veneration, Godwin published his memoir of his wife, whose unsparing honesty was quite unintentionally to shatter her reputation. Many regarded him now as a cold-blooded monster. Friendships were broken. Young Mary was to grow up in a family which was exceptionally isolated, even compared to other radical families in a wartime Britain which regarded any manifestation of democratic views to be tantamount to treason. Godwin longed to know whether his young daughter would inherit any of the qualities of her sainted mother, and so, while she was still a baby, he arranged for a phrenological examination, i.e. for her bumps to be read. Not surprisingly, she screamed while this was going on, but the doctor thought this probably didn't mean she'd be given to rages as an adult, and the shape of her head suggested memory and intelligence. But for her to demonstrate these qualities, she had to survive to adulthood, and this was, of course, by no means guaranteed. With 2 young children to bring through the dangers of childhood, William needed a wife, and within a few months of Mary's death, he set out to find one. Such behaviour might be thought cold-blooded today, but at the time it would have been considered totally normal. He offered marriage to several of his and Mary's friends, including Mary or Maria Reevely, who looked after Fanny during the most traumatic period, but he was turned down by all of them. So William had to struggle on by himself, aided by a housekeeper and Mary's faithful maid Marguerite, who helped with the childcare. Young Mary grew to consciousness as a rather sad, depressive child. Some people would say she always remained that way. One of her earliest memories was of being taken to visit her mother's grave and tracing the letters of the inscription on the tombstone, which she couldn't yet read. There's a theory that she grew up blaming herself for her mother's death, but this is based on a dubious interpretation of passages in Frankenstein. What is certain that she adored her father. William had become the centre of a circle of younger writers like Charles Lamb and William Hazlitt. The most dynamic of them was Samuel Taylor Coleridge. She remembered hiding behind the sofa while he recited his new poem, The Rime of the Ancient Mariner. Then, at the age of 4, her life changed dramatically. Her father had found the wife that he was looking for. She wasn't at all what anybody had expected. She was Mary Jane Clairmont, a widow with 2 young children. Just moved into the area, she introduced herself. "Have I the honour of beholding the immortal author of political justice?" she asked. "You do," said William. "Great being, how I adore you," she's supposed to have replied. He was smitten. So soon Mary and Fanny were being introduced to the Clairmont children, Charles and Jane. The 2 families went to see Puss in Boots at Astley's pantomime. Shortly after, William marked an X in his diary, the code he used for sexual activity. And not long after that, Mary Jane was pregnant. The pair hurriedly married, although the baby didn't survive. At what point William realised Mary Jane had been lying to him is not clear, but he certainly discovered that by the time he had to undergo 2 marriage ceremonies in one day. In the first, her surname was given as Vile, and in the second as Clairmont. The truth seems to be that there had never been a Mr. Clairmont at all, and she'd had 1 child in one relationship and the second by someone else. At some point, she spent time in a debtor's prison. How she got the money to acquire a house in Somers Town isn't known. She had lived in France, so perhaps through translation work. But now William, the man who didn't believe in marriage, found himself married to a wife of dubious character in a household of 4 children with 4 different fathers, only one of which, Mary, he could genuinely regard as his own. Most of his friends disapproved of the match and of the wife, and yet somehow against all the odds the marriage was a success. Mary Jane was intelligent. She'd translated the Swiss Family Robinson into English, and affectionate. She could be infuriating, was always threatening to leave when she didn't get her way, and constantly nagged William about moving to the country, but he genuinely loved her, and the relationship worked. His daughter, though, had a different view. We can't be sure because all the letters to and from Mary during her childhood have disappeared, but it seems she resented her stepmother from the start, and it may have been mutual. There was a rivalry between her and the Claremont children, since it soon became apparent that Mary was brighter and harder working than they were, and William always took his daughter's part. Mrs. Godwin, as she now was determined that all the children would receive a genteel upbringing, and that they were all taken to church every Sunday to listen to the sermons, and questioned afterwards as to what they'd heard. William, as an unbeliever, didn't accompany them. His wife ran the household on strict lines. Meals were plain, clothes were simple, and the beds were hard. But Mary's childhood was by no means completely unhappy. They were treats. When she was 11, Mary was taken on her birthday to Westminster Abbey to see the waxworks. The children, who now included a son, young William, went to the menagerie to see the lions and tigers, and William took them to visit an artist's studio, and not any artist, but his friend, J.M.W. Turner. But by this time, the family was hopelessly in debt. In the climate of the time, William's books didn't sell. Mary Jane, reduced to buying groceries on credit, urged him to write more popular stuff, and he tried, writing children's books, including a version of Aesop's Fables, but he wrote too slowly. He began to suffer mysterious blackouts, which were probably psychosomatic in origin, and which prevented him from working. Mary Jane suggested opening a bookshop specialising in children's literature, but he shied away from anything so commercial. But things got so bad that when Mary was 10, the family sneaked away without paying the rent and moved to a much less salubrious district opposite Newgate Prison. Mary and the other children could watch the condemned prisoners going off to their final journey to be hanged at Tyburn. But things are far more restrictive here than in Somers Town. There they could roam in the fields. Here they could hardly open a window because of the smell from the butcher's shops and slaughterhouses that surrounded them. For all this, Mary seems to have blamed her second mamma, as she called Mary Jane, and venerated her dead first mamma even more. Things grew worse when Mary Jane got her wish and opened her bookshop. Mary and the other children were expected to help in it, much to Mary's resentment. By this time, thanks to her father, she was formidably well educated. There were books everywhere, and he introduced her to philosophers he admired, like Locke and Rousseau. They had earnest discussions over dinner. He challenged her. How can the world be changed for the better? What can a government do to reform things? Should there even be a government? She held her own in these discussions, while the other girls, Fanny and Jane Claremont, looked in awe and resentment. It was obvious that she needed to go to a proper school. When she was 13, a bout of eczema, probably again psychosomatic, determined William to find the money to send her away to boarding school. This was a relief to Mary Jane, who was finding her an increasing burden with her sullen silences and sarcastic remarks. She went off to Ramsgate, but couldn't settle there and came home after 6 months to find that Jane had been given French and singing lessons while she'd been overlooked. William then came up with another plan. He would send her to Scotland. An admirer of his, who he never actually met, hearing of the difficulties that William was having with his daughter, offered to take Mary off his hands. He had a house full of daughters already, so one more wouldn't make much difference, and the fresh air of Scotland would cure all her ailments. Rather surprisingly, Mary agreed to go. The atmosphere at home had become so poisonous that she longed to get away. She knew that however much her father loved her, if it was a choice between her and his wife, he'd always choose Mary Jane. William sent detailed instructions on how to look after his wayward daughter. She has great talents, he wrote, and should be brought up as a philosopher, but she must be taught perseverance and not be coddled. In June 1812, she set off by sea alone, aged only 14. It was a terrible voyage. She suffered from seasickness the whole way, had all her money stolen, and arrived in Dundee penniless. Nonetheless, she was looking forward to living in such a romantic place, and in the end it exceeded even her expectations. The Baxter family lived in the village of Broughty Ferry, in a beautiful seaside location. The Baxters had remained loyal to the tenets of the French Revolution, and the daughters were given an independence Mary could only have dreamed of. She made friends with one of them, the one closest to her in age, Isabella. Isabella was everything Mary wanted to be and knew she wasn't: vivacious, warm and outgoing. Isabella revered her as the daughter of the great Mary Wollstonecraft, and thought her romantic and mysterious, but when she was really just shy. The friends would go off exploring the countryside or into Dundee itself for hours on or days at a time. At night they shared a room and sat up exchanging secrets and stories. It was here that Mary first conceived the idea that she might write fantastic stories herself one day. They scratched their... Sometimes this became a site of pilgrimage. Fans of Frankenstein came thousands of miles to see the letters MWG carved in the glass, until, in the 1970s, one of them stole the window. Mary soon became healthier and stronger, and her eczema disappeared. She returned home, but things were so unpleasant that she returned to Scotland as soon as she could. There she found that the situation had changed. The family was in mourning because Isabella's older sister had died, leaving her husband, who was 48, free to remarry. At first he paid court to Mary, but she made clear she wasn't interested, so he switched his attention to Isabella, who agreed to marry him. This was sensational, not only because of the 30-year age difference, but because it was against the rules of the Kirk to marry a dead wife's sister. The family stood by Isabella, and the marriage took place, leading to the Baxters being ostracised. Mary was thrilled by the whole thing. If only she could break the rules and have a great romance like that. And leaving Scotland for good and sailing back to London in May 1814, she was, unbeknownst to her, to have just such a romance. While she'd been away, a new presence had entered, or rather exploded, into the Godwin household. He was a wild young man and a budding poet named Percy Bysshe Shelley. He was honoured to meet the author of Political Justice, he said. He'd just come back from Ireland, where he'd attempted to instigate a rebellion, inspired, he said, by Godwin's philosophy of freedom. And long before that, he'd been sent down from Oxford for writing a pamphlet called The Necessity of Atheism. Such radical credentials impressed Godwin. Young Shelley was rich and aristocratic. Might not he be the answer to the family's potential money worries? He was also extremely handsome, and teenage girls had the habit of falling in love with him. Fanny and Jane promptly did so. Fanny was too timid to make her feelings known, but Jane, or Claire Claremont as she was later to style herself, was bolder. There was a difficulty about any romance developing, however, because Shelley had a wife. He'd previously eloped with another teenage girl, the 16-year-old Harriet Westbrook, and married her. He made no secret of this. He introduced Harriet to the family, and the girls were impressed by the fashionable clothes and her beauty. When Mary arrived home, she was warned to be on her best behaviour and be pleasant to this young man and his wife. Shelley had been talking airily of giving Godwin a loan which would banish all their financial problems. What Godwin didn't know was that Shelley had no funds of his own to do so. His father, the baronet, would no longer speak to his eldest son, let alone give him money, but he would nonetheless inherit the estate, so he could raise money, but only by post-obit loans, as they were called, gambling on his future inheritance and promising to repay them when he became Sir Percy at 4 times the original sum. Had he inherited, he would probably have bankrupted the estate, but of course he was never to do so. The family also didn't know that he and Harriet were estranged. Shelley had read Mary Wollstonecraft's Vindication and decided that marriage was an outmoded institution. He had only married Harriet because she insisted on it. Godwin had also once thought the monopoly of marriage was outmoded, but now he changed his mind. Traipsing around after her husband with his futile attempts to start a revolution by such methods as throwing bottles with incendiary messages into the sea, Harriet rapidly became disillusioned. But she was tied to him by the birth of their daughter, Ianthe. In Shelley's eyes, she began to change as she nagged him for mundane things like money. He began to think he made a terrible mistake, that Harriet was not the soulmate he'd thought, that it was hypocrisy to stay with her. He was perhaps subconsciously on the lookout for someone else. Godwin was now desperate for a loan, otherwise he faced debtor's prison. He invited Shelley to dinner to try and make another effort at persuasion. When Shelley entered the drawing room, he beheld a vision, or so he claimed later. He saw a pale girl with red hair he hadn't seen before, Mary. Instantly, he knew this was the woman of his dreams. Mary didn't know what to make of this young man with his muddy boots, shirt open to reveal his chest, and generally dishevelled appearance. She stayed silent and let the others do the talking. But when she did speak, she spoke so intelligently that Shelley realised that she was the true daughter of the divine Mary Wollstonecraft, a beautiful philosopher. He could see her soul, he wrote later, glowing like a lamp of vestal fire. Mary knew it was her duty to befriend Shelley to help her father, but her feelings for him soon went beyond mere friendship. She knew he was married, but she couldn't help herself. Here was someone who was misunderstood and lost, who needed love, and she was the one who could provide it. But was she prepared to defy convention and have a relationship with a married man? She was, of course, well aware of her mother's story. She defied convention, and look what that had led to. But after all, her father had been prepared to marry her, so surely he wouldn't object if she had an affair with Shelley, a young man he admired. They began meeting in secret, helped by Jane, who was perhaps hoping to persuade Shelley to pick her instead. Their favourite meeting place was St Pancras' churchyard, which of course was where Mary Wollstonecraft was buried. And it was often her books they discussed in their earnest philosophical discussions. Both were worried by the question of life after death. Did the dead live on in some way? Was Mary's mother haunting this place as a pale ghost? Was it possible to bring the dead back to life in some way? Shelley thought that perhaps it was. He'd been fascinated by science ever since his days in Oxford. He conducted his own chemical experiments. He was particularly fascinated by the power of electricity and the possibility this could be used to reanimate dead matter. Their relationship remained on this high plane for 6 weeks. Shelley became more and more convinced that this was the woman for him. Her mind was so original, he said later, much more original than mine. And of course, as the daughter of such parents, she shared his indignation at the injustices of the world. But nothing could happen until she declared herself. On the 27th of June 1814, she suddenly did so. Crying that she loved him, she threw herself into his arms. He, of course, responded, and there on the grass, by her mother's grave, the relationship became physical. It seems unlikely they went the whole way. It was, after all, a public place. But they both regarded this sublime and rapturous moment as the start of their life together. Shelley called the 27th of June his birthday, the day he'd been reborn. But it was far more momentous for Mary. He was already a social outcast. She was doing what genteel young women were warned they should never do. But she didn't care. In the spirit of her mother, she was defying convention and embarking on a great romance. When Shelley told her that his father had put him in an asylum and that Harriet had been unfaithful to him, she believed him. And even when she found out these stories were false, she never considered that he'd seduced her. They were true on a philosophical level. Now they had to get her father's approval. Mary thought this would be easy, but to her surprise, he was horrified and banished Shelley from the house. She was, after all, not yet 17. But the lovers continued in contact through long letters, with Jane acting as go-between. Eventually, Shelley plucked up courage and told Harriet their marriage was over. She blames Mary for seducing him. Godwin continued to try to break up the affair and told Shelley to go back to his wife. He lectured Mary on her behaviour, and she promised not to encourage Shelley's affections, but it was far too late for that. Shelley now burst into the house at Skinner Street, waving a pistol about and shouting that he couldn't live without Mary. If she consented to commit suicide by taking laudanum, he'd shoot himself, and they would be together in death like Romeo and Juliet. Mary calmed him down and got rid of him, but it was obvious things couldn't continue like this. A week later, Shelley himself took an overdose of laudanum, and Mary's stepmother, of all people, had to nurse him back to health. Mary herself was banished to the schoolroom at the top of the house, where she passed the time reading his poetry, particularly Queen Mab, with its statement that to force husband and wife to live together when there was no longer any affection was intolerable tyranny. This, of course, was Mary Wollstonecraft's view, and had once been Godwin's view too. And it was Mary's view. Unfortunately, it wasn't the law of England's view. But to Mary, it was essential to follow her heart. Yet how could she when she was locked up by her father? Something, of course, he had every right to do. To Shelley, this was oppression. And oppression of anyone, in any circumstance, was unacceptable. When his father had tried to discipline him, he chopped down his precious fir trees and tried to burn the house down, setting fire to the butler in the process. Now he began to make detailed plans to elope with her, something, of course, he'd done before. Jane having been caught, they bribed a servant to act as go-between. Shelley decided he would have to take both girls. Jane spoke French, and besides she was pretty, and he knew she was probably in love with him too, and envious of Mary. At 4 a.m. on the 28th of July, the two girls stole out of the house and rendezvoused with a waiting coach. They headed off for France, the land of revolution, although peace had now broken out, and Napoleon had been banished to Elba, the end of him, as everyone thought. At Dover, Shelley hired a fishing boat, and they made their way across to Calais, in the teeth of a storm which terrified the seasick girls, but which exhilarated him. Nothing being better than being out at sea in a storm, Shelley thought. Arriving at Calais, they checked into a hotel, but they were in for a shock. Mary Jane turned up. She wanted her daughter back. She tried to carry Jane off, but Shelley persuaded her to be true to her radical beliefs and stay. But Mary Jane was a dangerous person to thwart. She blamed Shelley and Mary for corrupting Jane and swore revenge. Back in London, she launched a campaign to denigrate them. The abandoned Harriet then joined in, alleging that Godwin had sold his daughters for £1,500. There was a grain of truth in this, for Shelley had at last agreed to lend Godwin the money he needed. But the outcome was an enormous scandal in London society which lasted for years. Mary was widely regarded as a whore. There was no way back now into polite society, even if she wanted to, and she didn't want to. The elated Shelley led the girls to Paris, and here at last he and Mary consummated their love. Disillusioned by post-revolutionary Paris, they headed south. But the countryside was no better. France was defeated and poverty-stricken, the population hostile. They lived on dry bread, slept in haylofts, and travelled by donkey or mule. They decided to head for Switzerland, a land of liberty, Shelley thought, based on his reading of a novel by Godwin about William Tell. It was also a more prosperous land, he thought. It turned out to be neither. But Shelley didn't care. He raved about the snow-clad peaks of the Alps. Mary was less impressed. She was tired and hungry and missing her father. Shelley was not quite the romantic hero he'd seemed to be, and the Swiss people were stupid and ugly. After sticking it out for 6 months, even Shelley was so bored, he decided they should return home. They travelled north along the Rhine, fortifying themselves by reading Mary Wollstonecraft's journals. And when they reached Holland, Mary discovered she was pregnant. Back in London, they discovered their true situation. No one who considered themselves respectable would have anything to do with them. Shelley discovered he had no cash left because Harriet had emptied his bank account. He had to go to her family, the Westbrooks, to borrow money from them, and with this he managed to secure lodgings. Mary wrote to her father, pleading for a reconciliation, but he made it clear he wanted nothing more to do with her, and had told his family and friends to shut her out of their lives. The next year was grim for all of them. They spent their time dodging creditors, writing begging letters, and constantly moving lodgings. To take their minds off their situation, Shelley began to systematically educate Mary, teaching her ancient Greek, while Jane, now transformed into Claire, daydreamed of becoming a famous writer, having many lovers, and stealing Shelley if Mary followed her mother's fate and died in childbirth. Some authorities hold that Shelley and Clare actually did become lovers, but no one knows because the relevant pages of their diaries were torn out in Victorian times. But Shelley certainly encouraged Mary to look elsewhere and start an affair with his friend Thomas Hogg. This came to nothing, and Mary now gave birth prematurely to a daughter who survived only for 13 days. Mary and Clare's relationship grew worse in their cramped surroundings with regular screaming matches. At last Mary seems to have given Shelley an ultimatum, her or me. Shelley knew he had to choose Mary. Clare was sent away as far as possible to a country cottage in Devon. The lovers were reconciled, and Mary soon found herself pregnant again. But now Shelley grew weak and listless, perhaps because of his vegetarian diet. But at that period, people automatically suspected consumption. It was considered urgent that they move to the country, and luckily he'd inherited some money from his grandfather, which enabled them to do so. Things began to look up for Mary. They could afford to rent a proper house and even employ servants. An idyllic period followed, at least as Mary later remembered it. As their health improved, they wandered about Windsor Great Park, discussing art and philosophy, a true marriage of equals such as her mother had advocated. Except it wasn't marriage at all, since Shelley still had a wife, very much alive, who'd just given birth to another child. But as Shelley concentrated on his writing, he could ignore her. His famous Defence of Poetry was written at this time, and it seems likely that many of the ideas in it are actually Mary's. In January 1816, Mary gave birth to a boy. They called him William after her father, hoping it would soften his attitude, but it didn't. Mary was bored now, stuck in the country with a baby, while Shelley was off to London, endlessly seeking money. But his efforts paid off, and he eventually managed to squeeze a settlement out of his father, which, without making them rich, banished their money worries. Meanwhile, Clare, having failed to ensnare Shelley, but still determined to acquire a celebrity lover, now set her sights on the most glamorous and scandalous celebrity of all, the bad Lord Byron. She peppered him with fan letters, boasting of her friendship with Shelley, Godwin, and the two Marys, mother and daughter. Byron was intrigued. He'd heard of the still largely unknown Shelley, and as a radical knew all about Godwin and Mary Wollstonecraft. She approached him just at the right time. His marriage with Annabella Milbank had broken up. He was denied access to his baby daughter, the future Ada Lovelace, and he was lonely and depressed. He wrote back to Clare, suggesting an assignation in his private box at Drury Lane, and they made love. Clare was in seventh heaven, and Byron too was for a time, writing her a poem in praise of her singing voice. But he soon grew tired of her. To try and keep hold of him, she promised to introduce him to her stepsister, implying that they might make a threesome. Mary loved Byron's poetry and agreed to meet him, but when the meeting came, all they did was sit and discuss literature. Disappointed, but desperate to keep hold of him somehow, Clare came up with another ploy. Byron was planning to go ahead and spend the summer on Lake Geneva. Why shouldn't she and the two Shelleys go with him and make up a foursome? Byron wasn't keen, but the Shelleys were. Mary was worried about the health of young William, while Shelley was disappointed at the hostile reception that the critics had given to his poem Alastor, and talked of abandoning his native country. Byron reluctantly agreed that if they went ahead, he would join them. So in early May 1816, Shelley, Mary, Clare, plus baby and servants, set off for France. It was to be a much more comfortable journey than the Shelleys' previous expedition, but the weather was dreadful. This was the notorious year without a summer, caused, as we now know, by a volcanic explosion in Indonesia. When they reached Switzerland, snow was still falling, and Mary was awed by the wintry landscape, descriptions of which she was to incorporate into Frankenstein. But then they reached Geneva, the sun came out, and they settled down in a hotel by the lake to wait for Byron. They sometimes rowed out onto the lake to admire its beauty, and memories of these happy days Mary also incorporated in her book. After 2 weeks, Byron appeared, causing a stir as usual by turning up in a huge carriage modelled on Napoleon's carriage. he'd just been visiting the battlefield at Waterloo, where he thought the wrong side had won. With him, he brought a menagerie of 8 dogs, 3 monkeys, 5 cats, an eagle, a crow, and a falcon, all of which the hotel was expected to accommodate. The two great poets met for the first time, Shelley being rather in awe of the older and more famous man. He was also introduced to Byron's young personal physician, John Polidori. Shelley was delighted to meet a man of science and immediately asked him to vaccinate young William against smallpox, which he did. Unbeknownst to anyone, Polidori had a second function, to keep a record of Byron's activities to feed the gossip columns back home. However, he was so fascinated with Mary that he paid more attention to her. While he and Mary went out on the lake, the two poets, finding they had almost everything in common, went on a pilgrimage to visit the grave of Rousseau. Claire, to her immense frustration, was left to fend for herself. The ordinary English tourists were put out by the appearance of this 19th century equivalent of a rock star, accompanied by what they called an actress, in modern parlance a groupie, and by another very suspicious-looking couple. Reported back to London, the party became a league of incest. Everywhere they went, they were greeted with silence and hostile stares. Shelley became fed up with this treatment and decided to rent a house on the other side of the lake, the Maison Chapuis. Byron then followed suit and rented a much grander house, the villa not far away, the Villa Diodati. He was delighted to discover that Milton had once stayed there because, of course, he identified with Satan in Paradise Lost. If any of them thought that moving out of town would bring them privacy, they were sorely mistaken. The hotel proprietor installed a large telescope so that his guests, like modern paparazzi, could observe what they were up to across the water. Fortunately, the weather was so appalling, they were soon cut off by a wall of grey mist. This was a relief at first, but unable to go outside, rapidly became boring, and Byron in particular became very agitated, a dangerous sign with him. They desperately needed something to occupy their minds. Polidori had declared his love for Mary and been rebuffed. So to cheer him up, the others agreed to listen to the draft of a play he'd written. It wasn't very good, but it sparked off a conversation which went on late into the night. Polidori read them his notes from a lecture he'd attended, given by the controversial surgeon William Lawrence. "God is not the creator of life," said Lawrence, "nor is there any such thing as a soul. Human beings are just bone, muscle and blood, nothing else." This chimed in with ideas that Shelley had long held. "In that case," he said, "how does life come into existence? Might it be possible for a man to be like Prometheus and actually create life himself? Have you heard of the experiments of Dr. Darwin?" He meant Erasmus Darwin, Charles's grandfather. "He put a piece of vermicelli in a glass case and applied an electric charge to it, and by some extraordinary means it began to move, apparently of its own volition. Now, if you could create a current of sufficient force, what might you be able to achieve?" Mary was horrified at these ideas. They seemed to be mocking the Creator, in which she at least still believed. And even if the work of these experimenters was noble and well-intentioned, wouldn't it turn out in the end to produce evil? The next day, the weather continued atrocious with constant rain and flashes of lightning. As they all huddled round the fire at the Villa Diodati, Byron read to them from a book of ghost stories. Suddenly he threw the book down. "These aren't frightening at all. I could write a better story than these, and so could you." He meant Shelley, of course, not thinking Polidori or the two women capable. "You're on," said Shelley. "We'll each write a story, and the person who comes up with the most horrific one will be the winner." This was agreed. Mary went back home to settle down and write. What happened next is the stuff of mythology. According to her later account, she struggled to write something until she fell asleep and had a nightmare. She saw a man, a pale student of unhallowed arts, as she called him, bending over something he seemed to have put together. Some powerful engine was applied to it, and the thing showed signs of life and turned into the hideous phantasm of a man. In other words, she dreamed the whole plot of Frankenstein. Not only is this inherently unlikely, but Shelley and Polidori were with her, and they didn't mention her struggles or her nightmare. Why would she make up such a story? There are several possible explanations. It might be that since women writers were still not really approved of, particularly ones with a notorious background like Mary, it was better to have as little to do with the authorship as possible and claim that she dreamed it all. Or maybe she was claiming that she'd had a prophetic vision while sleeping, thus making her an equal of male writers and artists who often claim that kind of inspiration, Coleridge with Kubla Khan being a recent example. Ultimately, we don't know. The group reassembled on yet another stormy night. It turned out that only Mary had taken the thing seriously. Claire was simply bored and took no part. They sat around in the flickering candlelight discussing ghosts and ghouls. Mary mentioned that her dead baby came back to haunt her in her dreams, which set off a discussion about whether the dead could come back to life. Byron started to read one of his favourite poems, Coleridge's Christabel, and when he got to the part where a beautiful lady turns into a hideous witch, Shelley suddenly had a fit, screaming out that he had a vision of a naked woman with eyes for nipples. Polidori was so impressed by this that he incorporated it into his story called The Vampire, a work which preceded Bram Stoker's Dracula by 80 years. Everyone else was completely shaken by the incident with Shelley, and the party was brought to an end. So, despite what's often believed, Mary never got the chance to read the first draft of her story on this occasion. But with the weather improving, and Shelley going off with Byron, she was left alone to continue to elaborate on it. Remembering the slaughterhouses of Skinner Street, she imagined creating a man out of body parts stolen from slaughterhouses and butcher shops. Eventually, she showed her draft to Shelley, who was enthusiastic and urged her to continue. She tapped her memories and imagination and came up with a remarkable twisted plot that neither Shelley or Byron could have produced. The hero gives life to his creature, she calls it, and far from feeling a sense of triumph, is horrified and repelled from what he's created. And then she begins to see the story from the point of view of the creature, the underdog, the outsider, rather like a woman living in a predominantly male world. The creature only wants his father's love, but when he's pushed away, as Mary herself had been, he turns to violence and murder. Although we see Frankenstein now as a pure horror story, this was certainly not her intention. Much of the idea of Frankenstein and his monster comes from Hollywood, not Mary Shelley. Despite her husband's fascination with the possibilities of electricity, she never explains what method Frankenstein used to create life. She's more interested in the moral and psychological aspects of the tale. She continued to work on the story. She went on an expedition with the others to Chamonix in the shadow of Mont Blanc. The sight of this great glacier filled her with sublime ecstasy, she wrote, and she incorporated her journal entry almost exactly into Frankenstein. But just as she was beginning to enjoy herself, the trip came to a sudden end. Claire discovered she was pregnant. Who was the father? Almost certainly it was Byron, but he disclaimed all responsibility. She'd had the honour of sex with him. What more did the woman want? To save her from destitution, Shelley agreed to give her an allowance, but now found himself accused of being the father himself. Eventually, Byron was persuaded to acknowledge paternity, with Claire being allowed to bring up the child, pretending to be her aunt. They all traipsed back to England. Having used up all his money, Shelley had to stay in London to deal with creditors, while Mary retreated to Bath to look after Claire and continue her book. She was just 19, and life seemed very gloomy after the excitement of Geneva, and Claire, missing Byron, was no company at all. She tried to distract herself by attending lectures, taking drawing lessons and practising Greek verbs. Her book was getting longer and taking on the appearance of a chase thriller, The Hunted and the Hunter, not unlike her own father's Caleb Williams. She decided the creature should chase his creator, Frankenstein, all the way to the Arctic. And there should be a new character, Captain Walton, an explorer who would tell the story through letters and act as a counterpoint to Frankenstein. He's the man who listens to sense, abandons his ambition to reach the North Pole, and so saves his men. It made the book more complex and more morally ambiguous. Who's really the hero and who the monster? But the basic moral is clear. We create our own monsters by denying them love or an education. The book was at last finished. Mary dedicated it to her father in another attempt to win him over. Her only connection with Skinner Street now was through her half-sister Fanny. But Fanny herself was desperately unhappy. In October 1816 she left home and headed west, probably bound for Ireland. Her father went after her, and on Mary's urging so did Shelley. He finally traced her to Swansea, but when he got there it was too late. She'd taken an overdose of laudanum. The local paper reported that the only identifying mark was the initial MW on her stays. Like Mary to the end, she remembered that she was the daughter of Mary Wollstonecraft. The necessity now was to cover up the circumstances of her death, because suicide was a crime. The bodies of suicides refused Christian burial and buried in unconsecrated places like crossroads. It was agreed to say that she died of a severe cold. Her death might have affected a reconciliation between Mary and her family, and Fanny seems to have intended it to produce this, but it made no difference. The Godwins blamed Shelley for causing Fanny to fall in love with him. Mary was guilt-ridden that she hadn't done more to help her half-sister. She concentrated now on revising Frankenstein. She showed Shelley the manuscript and asked him for his opinion. He suggested various improvements, some of which he incorporated. Effectively, he acted as editor. This has led to inevitable suggestions that a teenage girl like Mary couldn't possibly have really written it, and it must have been Shelley's work. But textual analysis has shown that Shelley wrote at most 4,000 words out of 72,000. 15 years later, Mary revised it again, and there's no doubt that the book is hers. Just before Christmas, there was more bad news. Fanny wasn't the only lonely and desperate woman. Shelley's abandoned wife, Harriet, had jumped off a bridge into the Serpentine and drowned herself. Now Mary was even more guilty. If she hadn't run away with Shelley, Harriet might still be alive. Having never shown any interest in his children, Shelley now rushed up to London to try to acquire the custody of little Ianthe and Charles. The Westbrook family were horrified when this lunatic turned up on their doorstep and refused permission to see them. But Shelley didn't give up and launched a letter-writing campaign whilst plotting to kidnap the children. He realised he'd have a better case if he was a married man, and so suggested that although neither he nor Mary believed in marriage, they should tie the knot. And so, these arch romantics were married in highly unromantic circumstances, just as Mary's mother and father had been. The event was so casual that Mary even put the wrong date in her diary. But if she hoped that it might bring a reconciliation with her father, she was right. Godwin was overjoyed and attended the ceremony, boasting of the good marriage his daughter had made with the eldest son of a baronet. Once he was married, Shelley redoubled his efforts to get his children back, and Mary supported him, despite it meaning she would have to look after 3 children, and because she was discovered that she was pregnant again, soon 4, and since Claire had now given birth to Byron's daughter, Allegra, potentially 5. To give her a rest, Shelley took her away to stay at his friend Leigh Hunt's house in Hampstead. Hunt was an exotic character, possibly of mixed race, and very eccentric, but a great friend of poets, including a new one he discovered, John Keats. Among other peculiarities, Hunt had in effect 2 wives and several children, and he willingly agreed to take on Allegra as well, thus lifting a burden from Mary's shoulders. And another potential burden was lifted when the courts refused to give Shelley custody of his children by Harriet. Normally in the 19th century, the widower would get automatic custody, but Shelley was now so notorious that his paternal rights were ignored and his application refused. Complaining that everyone in London hated him, Shelley decided they must move out and took a house at Marlow by the Thames, near that of his friend, Thomas Love Peacock. The house was bigger than anywhere Mary had lived before, with a large library, and she was delighted with it at first. The Hunts came to visit, and Leigh Hunt took her, the nymph with the sideways looks, as he called her, to the opera and introduced her to music. She completed the final draft of Frankenstein and prepared it for publication. The action was to take place, she decided, from December 17-something and climax in September the following year. By what is surely not a coincidence, Mary Wollstonecraft conceived her in December 1796 and gave birth to her in September 1797. So in a sense, the book and its creator are one. The story of Frankenstein is the story of Mary, and she identifies the creature with herself. She and Shelley now had to find a publisher for the book. They were turned down twice and eventually were accepted by Lackington's, an undistinguished firm. It was agreed it would be best for it to appear anonymously, Mary being a woman and having such a notorious husband and family background. She now set down to write a second book, a travelogue of her experiences in France and Switzerland, modelled on her mother's famous book about Scandinavia. Her work was interrupted by the birth of a daughter, who she called Clara, after Claire, for all her frustrating behaviour, the only sister she had left. But she finished the book and it was published 2 months before Frankenstein, although it was felt best for Shelley to appear as the author. Despite or because of this, it failed to sell well. The period at Marlow produced some of Shelley's greatest poetry, including The Revolt of Islam, with its call for women's freedom and equal rights, showing that he'd read and absorbed the teaching of Mary Wollstonecraft. He dedicated the poem to his wife and their daughter. But as the weather worsened, Mary grew unhappy. Shelley was in money trouble again and returned to London to dodge his creditors. Mary worried he was seeing Claire. But then he sent for her. Frankenstein was about to be published. It came out finally in November 1817. It didn't do well. The critics loathed it. The anonymous author was condemned as an atheist. The influential Quarterly Review branded it a tissue of horrible and disgusting absurdity. Sir Walter Scott liked it, and Mary was so pleased she wrote him a thank you letter, thus revealing her identity. But most people assumed a man had written it, and that Shelley must be the real author. Mary Wollstonecraft might have written in vain. It was obvious that the book wasn't selling. Indeed, it never made Mary any money. Shelley now pinned his hopes on The Revolt of Islam, but that didn't sell either. Worse still, the critics ignored it. Shelley now decided that he could no longer live in England. He was misunderstood and reviled everywhere, and politically the country was going to the dogs. He also had health worries. Mary feared he had TB. He ate hardly anything and dosed himself with laudanum. The doctors advised a warm climate, and it was decided to move to Italy, where Byron was already ensconced in Venice. Mary was delighted. They could take Claire and her baby with them and palm her off onto Byron. The Hunts would be heartbroken at their departure, but no one else. While Mary hastened to make preparations, Shelley spent his time in the British Museum, observing the marble statues that Lord Elgin had brought back from Greece. He was also fascinated by the Egyptian exhibits, particularly a huge statue of the pharaoh Ramesses II, whose eyes seemed to be following you. His imagination was fired, and he wrote what's now his most famous poem, Ozymandias. Shortly after, in March 1818, he, Mary, Claire and the children headed off for a new life. Only Mary and Claire were ever to return. That's the end of part 1.